Far from shore, the final moments of a ship were often heard before they were ever understood. Across the North Atlantic, the South Pacific, and isolated Arctic waters, radio operators once listened through bursts of static as routine transmissions slowly shifted into confusion, silence, or words that would later become impossible to explain. Some vessels vanished immediately after calm weather reports. Others left behind fragmented distress calls, strange signals, or unfinished messages that outlived the crews who sent them. In many cases, no wreckage was ever fully recovered, and no investigation could reconstruct what happened after the final transmission ended. You follow those last recorded signals into freezing storm systems, abandoned sea lanes, wartime shipping routes, and drifting ghost vessels discovered long after contact was lost. Naval archives, survivor testimony, disputed broadcasts, and scattered maritime records begin revealing how entire ships disappeared, while their final messages continued echoing through investigations for decades afterward. The farther these transmissions travel through static and open water, the less certain the truth surrounding them becomes. The SS Orang Medan and the broadcast about dead men. The waters between Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula carried thousands of ships in the years after the Second World War, moving through humid trade routes that smelled of fuel oil, salt and tropical rain. Yet among the endless traffic crossing the Strait of Malacca, one alleged distress call would outlive nearly every verified maritime disaster of the 20th century. The message itself was short, broken and strangely calm, reportedly intercepted by multiple radio operators somewhere in the late 1940s. According to later retellings, the transmission began with an announcement that every officer aboard a vessel called the SS Orang Medan was dead, followed by the claim that the crew had also perished, scattered across the bridge and chart room with their eyes open. Then came a final fragment of communication that transformed the incident from a little-known maritime report into one of the most debated ghost ship stories ever recorded. I die. The story has survived for decades precisely because so little about it can be proven with certainty. No official registry has ever conclusively identified a vessel named Orang Medan. Maritime historians have spent years searching Dutch shipping records without finding definitive confirmation that such a ship legally existed under that exact name. Even the phrase itself raises questions. Orang Medan appears to be a variation of Orang Medan, which roughly translates from Malay as man from Medan, referring to the large city in northern Sumatra. The spelling inconsistencies surrounding the ship became one of many details that complicated later investigations, because reports of the incident emerged through retellings, magazine articles, and secondary sources rather than through surviving official logs released directly to the public. Despite the uncertainty, the core narrative remained remarkably consistent across decades of retellings. Somewhere in the Strait of Malacca or nearby waters south of Singapore, radio operators aboard passing vessels allegedly intercepted a distress message transmitted in Morse code. One version of the message, widely repeated after appearing in maritime publications during the 1950s, read, "All officers, including captain, dead, lying in chart room and bridge. Possibly whole crew dead." After a pause, another message reportedly followed, "I die." Then silence. At the time these alleged transmissions were said to have occurred, the Strait of Malacca was one of the busiest and most dangerous maritime corridors in the world. Piracy remained a concern in some regions. Wartime mines still drifted through Southeast Asian waters years after the Japanese surrender, and smuggling networks moved cargo between colonial territories undergoing political upheaval. The Dutch East Indies had entered a violent struggle for independence following the collapse of Japanese occupation in 1945, and the surrounding seas became crowded with military patrols, merchant traffic, and vessels operating under uncertain legal authority. In such conditions, records were often incomplete, especially for smaller cargo ships moving through remote waters. One of the earliest substantial printed accounts appeared in a 1952 article, published by the German magazine Das Neue Universum. The story was later circulated more widely through British and American paranormal publications, particularly after author Vincent Gaddis included it in his 1965 book, Invisible Horizons. By then, the Orang Medan had already become entangled with broader maritime mysteries associated with the so-called Bermuda Triangle and other unexplained disappearances at sea. Yet unlike many exaggerated legends that grew larger over time, the details surrounding the Orang Medan remained unnervingly restrained. There were no sea monsters, no glowing apparitions, and no dramatic tales of survivors recounting impossible events. Instead, the mystery centered on dead silence, unexplained corpses, and a ship that supposedly vanished before investigators could properly examine it. According to the most common version of events, the distress signal was eventually picked up by American ships operating nearby, including a vessel named the Silver Star. The crew allegedly traced the signal and located the drifting Urang Medan somewhere in open water. As boarding parties approached, they reportedly noticed that the ship appeared strangely intact from the outside. There was no obvious collision damage, no signs of battle, and no visible fire. The vessel merely drifted motionless beneath the tropical heat. What the boarding crew supposedly discovered aboard the ship became the defining image of the entire legend. Every member of the crew was said to be dead. Some accounts claimed the bodies lay where they had collapsed during routine tasks, while others described sailors sprawled across the deck with terrified expressions frozen on their faces. The captain allegedly remained inside the wheelhouse, and the radio operator who transmitted the final distress call was reportedly found near his equipment. One recurring detail appears in nearly every version of the story. The dead crew supposedly had their mouths open and their eyes staring upward, as though they had died suddenly while witnessing something horrifying. Even among believers, this description has always been difficult to separate from embellishment added decades later. Maritime deaths caused by toxic gas leaks, chemical exposure, or carbon monoxide poisoning can indeed produce sudden fatalities without visible injuries, especially in confined environments aboard cargo vessels. Yet the image of a silent ship filled with dead sailors proved irresistible to writers specializing in unexplained mysteries, and the more the story spread, the more dramatic certain details became. Some versions added claims that the bodies felt unnaturally cold despite the tropical climate. Others suggested the crew had died with expressions of absolute terror. These additions are almost impossible to verify because no official photographs or authenticated reports from the alleged boarding operation have ever surfaced publicly. The final stage of the story is equally controversial. According to later retellings, smoke suddenly began rising from the lower sections of the Urang Medan, while the boarding crew remained aboard. The men from the Silver Star allegedly evacuated immediately, fearing an explosion. Shortly afterward, the drifting ship reportedly erupted in flames and exploded violently before sinking beneath the sea, taking all physical evidence with it. This ending solved one problem while creating another. If the ship truly exploded and disappeared before authorities could conduct a detailed investigation, it would explain why so little documentation survived. Yet the destruction of the vessel also removed the only possible source of verification. No wreckage conclusively linked to the Urang Medan has ever been identified, and no surviving passenger manifests, registry records, or insurance documents have fully confirmed the ship's existence. Historians who attempted to trace the incident found themselves trapped in a maze of contradictory accounts and missing paperwork. Part of the mystery's endurance comes from the era in which it allegedly occurred. Southeast Asia during the late 1940s was a region shaped by collapsing empires, secret military operations, and widespread smuggling. The Cold War had already begun reshaping intelligence networks across Asia, while European colonial powers fought to maintain control over territories demanding independence. Ships operating through Indonesian waters sometimes carried undeclared cargo, and several researchers have proposed that the Urang Medan may have been involved in illicit transport operations that authorities preferred not to publicise. One theory suggests the vessel carried dangerous chemicals, including potassium cyanide or nitroglycerin. In this interpretation, improperly stored cargo could have released toxic fumes that killed the crew before eventually triggering an explosion. The symptoms described in some versions of the story, particularly sudden death without visible injuries, loosely align with certain forms of poisoning. Nitroglycerin instability aboard cargo vessels was also a genuine maritime hazard during the early 20th century. Yet this explanation depends heavily on reports that cannot themselves be independently verified. Another theory involves nerve agents or chemical weapons transported secretly after the Second World War. During the final years of the war, both Allied and Axis powers experimented extensively with chemical agents, and there is historical evidence that surplus military chemicals were moved covertly across international waters during the chaotic post-war period. Some researchers speculated that the Urang Medan may have been smuggling dangerous substances that accidentally leaked aboard the vessel. This would potentially explain both the deaths and the lack of transparent investigation afterward, especially if military or intelligence agencies became involved. However, no documentary evidence has emerged linking the ship to any confirmed chemical weapons operation. Skeptics have raised even more fundamental objections. Several maritime historians argue that the entire story may have originated as an exaggerated magazine tale rather than a real incident. The lack of official Dutch registration records remains one of the strongest arguments against the ship's existence. Others point out that the dramatic wording of the distress call resembles the style of pulp mystery writing popular during the mid-20th century. In this view, the Orang Medan was less a lost ship than a gradually evolving maritime legend assembled from scattered rumours and fictional embellishments. Yet the story refuses to disappear because fragments of evidence continue to complicate outright dismissal. Researchers have located references suggesting that at least some form of incident involving a mysterious distress signal circulated among maritime communities during the early 1950s. The problem is that each surviving account differs slightly from the next. Dates change, locations shift. The names of rescue ships vary depending on the source. Instead of disproving the story completely, these inconsistencies have created the impression of a real event distorted through incomplete transmission and retelling. Maritime history contains many verified examples of ships discovered abandoned or crews killed under baffling circumstances. In 1872, the merchant brigantine Mary Celeste was found adrift in the Atlantic with its cargo intact, but its crew missing forever. During both World Wars, vessels occasionally vanished without trace after covert military operations or unrecorded attacks. Even in modern times, fires, toxic leaks, rogue waves, and structural failures have erased ships so quickly that investigators struggle to reconstruct what happened. The sea has always possessed the ability to destroy evidence faster than authorities can collect it. Radio technology itself contributed to the strange atmosphere surrounding incidents like the Orang Medan. During the early and mid-20th century, Morse code distress calls carried an eerie intimacy. Operators often worked alone in dim radio rooms filled with static, listening to fragmented transmissions arriving from beyond the horizon. Storm interference, weak signals, and overlapping frequencies could distort messages into ghostly fragments. Maritime radio logs from the era contain countless examples of interrupted distress calls that ended abruptly when ships lost power or sank. Against that background, the reported phrase "I die" felt unusually personal and final, stripped of technical language and reduced to the last words of a dying operator surrounded by silence. By the late 20th century, the Orang Medan had become firmly embedded in popular mystery culture. Paranormal writers linked it to supernatural explanations ranging from unidentified creatures to extraterrestrial encounters. Some stories suggested the crew had witnessed something impossible before death overtook them. Others proposed electromagnetic anomalies or secret military experiments. These theories gained popularity largely because the verified historical record remained so thin. The less evidence available, the easier it became for speculation to fill the empty spaces. More grounded researchers attempted to separate the legend from the exaggerations. In the early 2000s, investigations by maritime historians and skeptical writers examined archival material in an effort to determine whether the story originated from a real shipping accident. Some researchers pointed toward a 1948 reference in the Proceedings of the Merchant Marine Council, which briefly mentioned a strange case involving a vessel found with dead crew members before catching fire. Yet even these references lacked enough detail to conclusively confirm the legend as commonly told. What makes the Orang Medan so enduring is not merely the possibility that a ship disappeared under mysterious circumstances, but the unsettling absence of certainty surrounding every part of the case. If the ship never existed, then the story represents one of the most successful maritime legends ever created, emerging without a clear author and embedding itself into historical discussion for more than half a century. If the ship did exist, then an unknown number of men died somewhere in Southeast Asian waters under circumstances that were never properly recorded, leaving behind only fragments of radio transmissions and contradictory memories. The Strait of Malacca itself deepens the atmosphere surrounding the mystery. Stretching between Indonesia and Malaysia, the narrow waterway has served for centuries as one of the world's most important maritime passages. Merchant fleets from Arabia, China, Europe, and India crossed these waters long before modern shipping lanes existed, and countless vessels vanished there through storms, piracy, disease, and war. Even today, the strait remains crowded with tankers and cargo ships moving through dense tropical haze. At night, radio chatter still drifts across the darkness between ports, carrying voices from ships beyond sight. Somewhere within that atmosphere, the legend of the Orang Maiden continues to linger because it touches a specific fear tied closely to the sea itself. The terror of receiving a final human message without ever learning what caused it. Maritime disasters usually leave evidence behind. Wreckage washes ashore. Survivors testify. Investigators reconstruct the final hours. The Orang Medan offers none of those things. Instead, it leaves only an alleged distress call describing death already waiting aboard the ship before the transmission even ended. Beyond the fading radio static, whatever happened aboard the Orang Medan slipped into the same darkness that swallowed the ship itself, along with a truth that may never have truly existed. The MV Joyita and the silence that drifted across the Pacific. Low clouds drifting above the South Pacific often concealed entire shipping routes beneath layers of rain, haze, and distance where vessels could travel for days without visual contact from shore. Maritime trade across these waters depended heavily on timing and radio communication because the oceans separating island groups was too vast for constant observation, leaving ships isolated between scattered relay points and small coastal stations. Within that environment, even a routine delay could slowly transform into uncertainty once expected transmissions failed to arrive across the silence of open water. Merchant routes across the South Pacific in the mid-1950s depended on a fragile balance of timing, distance, and radio contact that rarely tolerated deviation without consequence. Ships moved between widely separated island groups where navigation was reliable only when communication remained steady, and even brief silence could carry a weight that grew heavier the longer it continued. In that environment, the MV Joyita would later become one of the most unsettling absences recorded in post-war Pacific shipping history, not because of what was immediately known, but because of what failed to be heard when it mattered most. MV Joyita occupied one of those unremarkable commercial lanes between island nations where ships were expected to appear, communicate, and vanish again into scheduled obscurity. It was not a vessel associated with grand voyages or military significance, but a working trading ship engaged in routine transport across the South Pacific, where maritime life depended more on consistency than spectacle. Yet the very normality of its route would later deepen the unease surrounding its disappearance, because nothing in its planned passage suggested it would not return. The vessel itself carried an unusual history long before its disappearance in 1955. Originally constructed in the United States during the Second World War, the MV Joyita had been designed with structural buoyancy features that later became central to the mystery surrounding its discovery. Portions of the ship incorporated cork lining and buoyant construction materials intended to improve survivability in difficult conditions, characteristics that would eventually allow the vessel to remain partially afloat even after severe damage and abandonment. Radio coverage across the vast Pacific during this period relied heavily on intermittent relay points, meaning even routine transmissions could fade into unreadable fragments over open water. Communication between vessels and shore stations was not continuous, but dependent on geography, atmospheric conditions, and the reach of available equipment, leaving wide stretches where silence was expected rather than alarming. Still, silence only remained ordinary until it exceeded the limits of schedule and reason. Sailing conditions near Samoa and the Tokelau chain often shifted without warning, creating stretches of ocean where vessels could drift beyond reliable contact for extended periods. These waters were not unfamiliar to traders or navigators, yet their remoteness meant that delays could quickly become uncertain events in themselves, especially when no secondary signal confirmed a ship's position. In such conditions, absence of communication carried a different kind of meaning, one shaped as much by expectation as by danger. Records later confirmed that MV Joyita departed Apia, Samoa, in early October 1955, carrying both cargo and passengers on what was intended to be a routine inter-island voyage. Its destination lay within established trading routes, and nothing in its departure suggested deviation from normal maritime operations. It left behind no documented indication of distress, no recorded mechanical failure at the time of departure, and no immediate reason to suspect that the voyage would end outside of standard expectations. The cargo aboard the MV Joyita reflected the practical realities of Pacific Island trade during the period, consisting of commercial goods, medical supplies, and everyday materials moved between remote communities dependent on maritime transport. Ships operating these routes functioned as critical economic links connecting isolated island populations to larger supply networks. The disappearance therefore affected not only those aboard, but also regional communities accustomed to relying on predictable vessel movement across the Pacific. Scheduled arrival times for ships in this region were not merely logistical expectations, but essential markers used by authorities to confirm that communication systems were functioning correctly. In remote island networks, arrival confirmations acted as both navigational checkpoints and indirect communication safeguards, ensuring that vessels remained accounted for across vast and uneven distances. When those markers failed to appear, the absence itself became the first sign that something had shifted beyond routine maritime delay. Concerns began to surface only after the MV Joyita failed to establish routine contact within the time window that normally accompanied its passage between known navigation points. No single transmission marked the beginning of alarm, but rather a gradual recognition that expected signals were not arriving at all. In the absence of clear communication, uncertainty replaced assumption, and the ship's progress became a matter of inference rather than confirmation. Search coordination across scattered island stations revealed an early pattern of uncertainty, where each expected radio signal from the MV Joyita remained absent without immediate explanation. Operators listened for routine updates that never arrived, while neighbouring stations checked frequencies that remained empty of identifiable traffic. The silence was not initially treated as catastrophic, but it steadily accumulated into something more difficult to dismiss. Pacific maritime communication systems during the 1950s still depended heavily on manual radio monitoring practices where operators listened for scheduled traffic through static, atmospheric interference and overlapping regional transmissions. Ships passing through remote sectors sometimes experienced partial communication interruptions without immediate alarm, yet the complete absence of recognizable contact from the MV Joyita gradually separated the case from ordinary delay patterns. Each missed reporting interval increased uncertainty surrounding the vessel's location and condition. Aerial reconnaissance efforts eventually expanded across hundreds of miles of open ocean, reflecting how quickly routine delay can escalate into regional search operations in remote waters. Aircraft scanned vast stretches of water that offered no clear visual markers of disaster, only the shifting surface of the Pacific moving under changing light and wind. The absence of debris or confirmed sightings only deepened the uncertainty surrounding the vessel's last known trajectory. Weather reports from the period described shifting currents and moderate conditions that offered no obvious environmental cause for a complete loss of contact with the MV Joyita. There were no documented cyclones or large-scale storm systems directly aligned with its intended route during the critical time frame, leaving investigators without a clear environmental explanation for the disappearance. In the absence of extreme weather, attention naturally shifted toward other possibilities, though none immediately presented themselves with certainty. Weeks passed before any physical trace of the vessel emerged, forcing investigators to reassess whether the MV Joyita had deviated from its intended route or encountered something unforeseen. The search, which had expanded across oceanic distances, began to narrow again as fragments of possibility replaced earlier assumptions. Yet even as theories multiplied, no definitive signal or wreckage confirmed the ship's final position. The eventual discovery of the MV Joyita revealed a drifting hull that remained partially afloat, yet showed signs that contradicted expectations of a typical maritime disaster. The vessel was found in a condition that suggested survival rather than total destruction, as though it had resisted the most final outcome that usually accompanies abandonment at sea. Its presence in the water confirmed that it had not vanished entirely, but its condition raised immediate questions about what had occurred aboard. Inspection details recorded by search crews noted that the vessel was still structurally buoyant despite visible damage and a complete absence of crew and passengers aboard. Life-saving equipment appeared incomplete or inconsistently used, and the arrangement of certain items suggested disruption rather than orderly evacuation. The MV Joyita, still named and still afloat, had become a floating absence rather than a ship in any conventional sense. Investigators examining the interior of the vessel discovered additional details that intensified the mystery surrounding the disappearance. Medical supplies were reportedly scattered, equipment appeared displaced, and portions of the vessel showed signs of flooding that had not fully overwhelmed the ship itself. Some clocks aboard were stopped, while certain operational systems appeared partially functional, creating a fragmented picture that resisted clear chronological reconstruction. Navigation equipment aboard the MV Joita appeared inconsistent with normal abandonment patterns, suggesting that the vessel had not simply been evacuated in an orderly emergency. Instruments were present but not fully functional in the manner expected after routine shutdown, and their condition added another layer of uncertainty regarding the sequence of events that unfolded before the ship was found. The absence of clear procedural traces complicated every attempt to reconstruct its final hours. Radio equipment became one of the most heavily examined aspects of the investigation because communication failure remained central to the mystery. Reports indicated that portions of the vessel's radio system may not have been fully operational at the time of the disappearance, while antenna damage and power limitations complicated analysis of whether distress transmissions had been attempted but never successfully broadcast. This uncertainty surrounding the communication system preserved the unresolved question of whether the crew had tried to send a final message that simply never reached anyone. Search teams documented no confirmed distress call that clearly identified the moment when communication with the MV Joita had permanently ceased. Despite the importance of radio equipment in such situations, no definitive final transmission was recovered that explained the shift from operation to silence. Instead, investigators were left with a gap where communication should have existed, a gap that became central to every later interpretation. Investigators examining the empty vessel encountered conditions that raised more questions than answers, particularly regarding the sequence of events that led to its abandonment. The physical evidence did not align neatly with any single explanation, leaving room for competing interpretations that struggled to account for all observed details simultaneously. Each element of the discovery seemed to point toward a different conclusion without fully confirming any of them. Some later theories suggested that flooding and mechanical failure may have created the appearance that the vessel was in immediate danger of sinking, potentially prompting a rushed evacuation despite the ship's unusual buoyancy. Others questioned whether human error, panic, or external interference contributed to the disappearance of everyone aboard. Yet every explanation encountered the same unresolved contradiction that defined the case from the beginning. The MV Joita was found still floating, while every person who had been aboard remained missing. Theories developed in later assessments ranged from structural failure to possible human intervention, yet none fully accounted for the absence of clear final communication. Mechanical issues could explain certain conditions, while external interference could account for others, but neither category resolved the central contradiction of a functioning vessel that had lost every trace of its human presence without explanation. The MV Joita remained suspended between possibilities that refused to converge. Each proposed explanation for the fate of MV Joita ultimately returned to the same unresolved gap where the ship's last coherent transmission should have existed. Whether interpreted through engineering, human action, or environmental factors, the absence of final communication remained the defining feature that resisted closure. The silence itself became the most persistent evidence, even as everything else faded into uncertainty. The Pacific remained unchanged in its vast continuity, holding only the quiet shape of a message that never reached anyone at all. The Carroll A. Deering and the lightship warning nobody understood. Recorded entries from coastal navigation stations along the North Carolina shoreline in the early 20th century begin not with incidents at sea, but with repeated confirmations of vessel positions passing through monitored waters that would later become central to the Carroll A. Deering case. These records were not created to tell stories, but to maintain order across one of the most unpredictable stretches of the Atlantic coast, where Diamond Shoals and the approaches to Cape Hatteras demanded constant attention from both lighthouse crews and offshore lightship stations. Within those routine notations, the presence of passing schooners like the Carroll A. Deering was expected to appear as simple logistical confirmation, yet certain later entries would stand out for reasons that were never fully clarified at the time they were written. Maritime traffic records from the post-First World War period place the schooner Carroll A. Deering within a heavily travelled corridor where merchant vessels frequently relied on lighthouse coordination to maintain safe passage. The route along the American eastern seaboard was not unusual for a 5-masted commercial schooner of its kind, and nothing in its documented purpose suggested deviation from standard trade activity. Yet the importance of these waters was never purely commercial, since the same channels that guided cargo vessels northward also intersected with one of the most hazardous coastal systems in the region, where navigation depended as much on visual confirmation from shore stations as it did on charts carried aboard the ships themselves. Lightship stations positioned off the North Carolina coast operated as fixed reference points for ships approaching the hazardous waters near Diamond Shoals. These floating beacons were essential in an era when electronic navigation systems were still limited, serving as both warning markers and communication nodes for vessels that might otherwise drift too close to shifting sandbanks. Crew aboard these stations were trained to observe not only weather and sea conditions, but also the subtle behaviours of passing ships, noting course deviations or irregular movements that might indicate navigational uncertainty long before a vessel reached critical danger. Reports preserved from coastal observation posts describe intermittent visual contact with passing vessels that occasionally failed to behave according to expected navigational patterns. These were not always treated as emergencies, since maritime traffic in the region was known for adjustments in course due to tides and wind. Yet some entries recorded ships appearing in positions that did not match their anticipated progression along established routes. It was within this observational environment that the Carroll A. Deering continued its final documented voyage toward the North Atlantic, still functioning as a working schooner within a heavily monitored corridor. The Carroll A. Deering was recorded as continuing its voyage through this region in January 1921, moving along established routes that connected Caribbean trade corridors to Northern Atlantic ports. Its journey, on paper, followed a familiar pattern for commercial sailing vessels of the period, and nothing in its departure sequence suggested an abnormal trajectory. Yet the significance of its presence in these waters would only emerge later, when its expected passage through coastal monitoring points failed to align with subsequent confirmations from shore-based systems. Lighthouse personnel stationed along Cape Hatteras later documented unusual sightings that did not initially raise alarm but were noted for their irregular timing and positioning. These observations were not framed as immediate threats, yet they contributed to a growing collection of maritime inconsistencies recorded in the days surrounding the vessel's final approach to the area. The Carroll A. Deering was not always explicitly identified in every account, but later cross-referencing of vessel movement suggested that multiple sightings likely corresponded to its final passage through monitored waters. Signals exchanged between maritime stations during this period reveal a pattern of uncertainty, where identifiable vessels were observed without clear confirmation of intent or communication. The system relied heavily on mutual recognition between ships and coastal stations, yet there were instances where presence alone was insufficient to establish clarity of purpose. In such moments, what mattered was not only whether a ship was seen, but whether its behaviour matched the expected logic of navigation, and in this case, certain inconsistencies began to accumulate in retrospective analysis. Lightship crews positioned offshore reported moments in which ships appeared visually present in monitored waters, but did not respond in expected navigational sequences. These encounters were not always recorded as emergencies, yet they introduced an element of hesitation into otherwise routine observation logs. The inability to reconcile visual confirmation with expected response patterns created a kind of observational tension, where the existence of a vessel was certain, but its operational intent remained unclear. Coastal observers tracking vessel movement near the Outer Banks described conditions where identification markers could be seen, but not reliably interpreted at distance. Atmospheric distortion, shifting light conditions, and the natural haze of sea spray often complicated visual confirmation. Yet the repeated nature of such accounts suggested something more persistent than simple environmental interference. Within this uncertainty, the Carroll A. Deering remained an active reference point in later investigations attempting to reconstruct its final hours. Navigation logs associated with the Carroll A. Deering indicate continued movement through known Atlantic routes until the final recorded phase before its disappearance from operational tracking. After this point, no definitive sequence of communication or positional confirmation was recorded that could conclusively establish its transition from monitored voyage to unaccounted status. The gap that followed would later become the central focus of inquiry, not because it was immediately dramatic, but because it was structurally incomplete. Fishing vessels operating near Cape Hatteras in early 1921 later contributed fragmented accounts of encountering ships behaving in ways that diverged from standard maritime procedure. These accounts were not uniform, and many were recorded after the fact, yet they contributed to a broader pattern of uncertain observations in the region. Within this scattered testimony, the Carroll A. Deering became increasingly difficult to isolate as a single continuous narrative, instead appearing as a series of partially aligned sightings across different points in time. The eventual discovery of the Carroll A. Deering off the North Carolina coast revealed a grounded schooner positioned on Diamond Shoals, under conditions that immediately drew official attention. The wreck's location alone confirmed that the vessel had encountered the hazardous coastal zone that maritime authorities had long identified as a major navigational risk. Yet its conditions suggested that grounding was only part of the sequence that led to its final state. Salvage and inspection teams arriving at the wreck site recorded a vessel that had clearly encountered catastrophic grounding forces but retained structural elements that complicated initial interpretations. The ship was not reduced to complete fragmentation, and its presence above the waterline allowed for examination that typically would not be possible in total wreck loss scenarios. Yet what stood out most was not simply damage, but absence, since key operational indicators and human presence were not consistent with expected abandonment patterns. Documentation from the investigation phase notes that essential equipment and crew presence were absent, despite the ship itself remaining physically identifiable and largely intact above the waterline. The Carroll A. Deering was unmistakably present as a maritime structure, yet its operational life had been stripped away in a manner that resisted straightforward explanation. This contrast between physical survival and human absence became one of the defining contradictions of the case. Maritime authorities reviewing the case identified discrepancies between the observed wreck condition and the expected outcomes of standard grounding scenarios in similar coastal environments. Ships that ran aground under comparable conditions typically left behind clearer sequences of distress, damage progression, or crew evacuation patterns, yet the Carroll A. Deering did not conform neatly to any single category of maritime accident. Instead, it occupied an ambiguous position between accident, abandonment, and unresolved interruption. Subsequent analysis of pre-wreck coastal reports suggested that multiple independent observers had recorded the Carroll A. Deering in motion under circumstances that later proved difficult to reconcile. These observations did not converge into a single consistent narrative, but instead formed overlapping fragments that resisted full alignment. The more these accounts were compared, the more they highlighted gaps in timing, identification, and interpretation rather than clarifying the ship's final movements. Theories developed around the incident often returned to earlier lightship and lighthouse observations, where ambiguous signals and visual inconsistencies formed the only prelude to the wreck. Explanations ranged across a wide spectrum of maritime speculation, yet each attempt to resolve the case inevitably circled back to the same foundational problem: that the available observations did not resolve into a coherent sequence of cause and effect. The Carroll A. Deering remained anchored in documentation that suggested presence, motion, and disappearance, without allowing any single interpretation to fully stabilize. Each interpretation of the Carroll A. Deering case ultimately circles back to the same unresolved issue, where recorded observations existed without ever forming a coherent explanation of events. The records remain, the sightings remain, and the wreck remains, yet the transition between them refuses to assemble into a continuous account that satisfies either maritime logic or historical closure. The sea had not erased what happened to the Carroll A. Deering, but it had ensured that nothing that was seen could ever be fully made to agree with itself. The SS Beichimo and the crew that walked away forever. Arctic shipping operations along the Alaskan coast in 1931 were shaped less by open water navigation and more by the unpredictable formation of dense pack ice capable of immobilizing even reinforced cargo vessels. In these regions, movement was never guaranteed, and progress often depended on narrow seasonal windows where ice fields briefly receded before returning with renewed pressure. Within that environment, ships like the SS Beichimo were not merely travelling through water, but through a shifting landscape that could close around them without warning. Cargo routes passing through the northern reaches of the Bering and Chukchi Seas frequently depended on seasonal timing that determined whether vessels could complete passages before ice fields closed in. These routes connected remote trading posts along the Alaskan coast, where maritime supply lines were essential for survival during long winter months. The SS Beichimo operated within this system as part of a commercial transport cycle that relied on careful coordination between shipping companies, coastal stations, and local settlements dependent on infrequent deliveries. Wireless communication aboard Arctic steamers during this period served as a critical operational tool, allowing trapped vessels to report conditions long before physical rescue became possible. Messages transmitted over vast northern distances carried essential information about ice pressure, hull integrity, and crew safety, forming a lifeline between immobilized ships and the outside world. It was within this system that the SS Beichimo began sending a series of updates that would later define the final confirmed phase of its active service. The SS Beichimo entered these northern waters as part of a routine commercial voyage, carrying cargo intended for distribution across isolated Alaskan trading points. Nothing in its initial journey suggested deviation from expected maritime behaviour, and its route followed established supply lines that had been used repeatedly during previous seasons. Yet the Arctic environment into which it sailed was already shifting, and the conditions that would soon surround the vessel were forming long before its final position was recorded. Ice conditions in the region shifted with rapid intensity, often transforming navigable channels into compressed fields that exerted structural pressure on hulls within a matter of hours. Unlike open ocean hazards, pack ice did not strike suddenly, but advanced through gradual accumulation, tightening around vessels until movement became restricted or impossible. The SS Beichimo found itself caught within this process, where progress slowed, then stopped entirely, as surrounding ice began to dominate its position. Operational logs from Arctic voyages of this era frequently describe vessels becoming immobilized not through damage, but through the gradual tightening of surrounding ice formations. This distinction mattered greatly for crews, since structural integrity could remain intact even while mobility disappeared completely. In such situations, ships often entered a state of controlled waiting, where decisions depended on whether environmental conditions might improve or continue to deteriorate. The SS Beichimo transmitted multiple wireless updates while trapped, including a final recorded condition report sent before the decision to abandon the vessel, marking the last confirmed communication from onboard crew before the ship was left to the ice. These transmissions documented its situation with increasing urgency, reflecting the growing pressure of the surrounding pack ice and the diminishing feasibility of continued occupation. The final message in this sequence represented not a dramatic distress call, but a concluding operational acknowledgement that conditions had reached a critical threshold. Shipping records indicate that assistance efforts were considered during the period of immobilization, though access to the vessel became increasingly limited as ice conditions worsened. Attempts to approach trapped ships in such environments were often delayed or redirected entirely, since ice fields could shift faster than rescue operations could advance. The SS Beichimo remained physically present within the ice, but increasingly isolated from any practical means of extraction. As Arctic temperatures continued to drop, the surrounding ice field surrounding the SS Beichimo expanded in thickness, creating conditions that made sustained evacuation or towing increasingly impractical. The pressure exerted by expanding ice could immobilize propellers, warp hull structures, and eliminate any safe passage corridors required for coordinated rescue. In this environment, time itself became a limiting factor, narrowing the window in which intervention remained possible. Decisions made aboard trapped vessels in similar conditions often relied on the balance between structural integrity and the safety thresholds of remaining crew operations. The SS Beichimo existed within this narrow decision space, where continued presence aboard the ship eventually became more dangerous than abandonment. The final operational calculations reflected not uncertainty about the ship's condition, but uncertainty about whether remaining with it would allow survival. The SS Beichimo was eventually abandoned when conditions reached a point where continued occupation of the vessel was no longer considered viable for survival. Crew members left the ship behind in an environment that was still actively reshaping its position, leaving it embedded within the ice field that had initially trapped it. At the moment of abandonment, the SS Beichimo ceased to function as an active vessel and became instead an object left within a moving Arctic system. Following abandonment, the SS Beichimo remained physically intact within the ice field for a period that extended beyond the immediate expectations of maritime salvage planning. Reports indicated that the vessel did not immediately collapse or break apart, despite being left without crew in severe conditions. Instead, it persisted in a state of structural endurance, embedded within ice that continued to shift around it. Reports from later Arctic expeditions suggest that the vessel did not remain permanently fixed in one position, despite having been left without crew during its initial entrapment. This introduced a complication into early assumptions about its fate, since a vessel abandoned in ice would normally be expected to remain stationary or degrade in place. Instead, the SS Bechimo appeared in later sightings far from its original abandonment point. Mariners operating in northern waters during subsequent years occasionally recorded sightings of a drifting vessel matching the description of the SS Bechimo. These observations were not continuous but intermittent, appearing across different voyages and time periods without forming a single trackable route. The ship seemed to reappear within Arctic waters in ways that defied straightforward mapping or recovery logic. These intermittent observations occurred across widely separated regions, suggesting movement patterns that did not align with standard salvage retrieval timelines. In some accounts, the vessel was seen partially icebound, while in others it appeared in open drift conditions, separated entirely from the ice that had once confined it. The SS Bechimo existed in these reports as a recurring presence, rather than a consistently tracked object. Arctic patrols and merchant captains contributed fragmented accounts of encountering the SS Bechimo in varying states of ice exposure and open water drift. Each sighting added another point of reference without fully connecting to previous ones, creating a pattern of recurrence without continuity. The vessel's identity remained recognizable, but its position in time and space became increasingly difficult to stabilize. No single authority maintained continuous oversight of the SS Bechimo after its abandonment, resulting in an incomplete tracking history across multiple decades. Without centralized monitoring, each sighting existed as an isolated entry rather than part of a unified record. The ship became defined not by a single disappearance, but by the absence of a complete chain of verified movement. Later, historical assessments attempted to reconstruct the vessel's movements, but the recorded sightings of the SS Bechimo never formed a continuous navigational chain. Gaps between observations remained too large to bridge with certainty, leaving only fragments of its post-abandonment existence. The result was a vessel that could be confirmed in multiple moments, but never fully followed between them. The Arctic waters carried on as if the SS Bechimo had never left them, even as it continued appearing in places no record could fully connect. The USS Cyclops and the final transmission lost in the Atlantic. Operational routing across the Atlantic during the First World War forced naval planners to depend heavily on predictable movement schedules that could sustain fleet activity across enormous maritime distances. Coal transport vessels occupied a particularly critical position within this structure, because every major warship, escort vessel, and support formation depended on reliable fuel delivery to maintain deployment capability. The USS Cyclops therefore operated not as an isolated cargo carrier, but as a central logistical asset moving within a tightly coordinated naval system, whose efficiency depended on timing, communication accuracy, and uninterrupted transatlantic continuity. Naval logistics operations during the First World War relied on coordinated transatlantic movement of coal transport vessels that sustained fleet activity across multiple theatres of conflict. Every ship within this system functioned as part of a broader operational network where timing, cargo weight, and communication accuracy determined not only efficiency, but military readiness across entire naval formations. Within that tightly controlled structure, the USS Cyclops was recorded as one of the largest and most heavily utilized colliers assigned to sustain American naval operations in the Atlantic, a vessel whose scale alone made its movement significant within wartime supply planning. Fleet records maintained by the United States Navy during this period place the USS Cyclops within a structured supply network responsible for transporting essential fuel resources between Atlantic ports. The vessel was designed for endurance rather than speed, built to carry large quantities of coal across long distances where refueling stations were limited or absent. Its role was not experimental or unusual, but central to the logistical backbone that supported wartime naval activity across both hemispheres, meaning its movements were carefully integrated into broader operational expectations. Coal distribution routes between Caribbean supply points and the eastern seaboard were monitored through scheduled port communications that verified vessel progress at defined intervals. These routes were carefully tracked to ensure that supply chains remained uninterrupted, particularly during a period when maritime threats and operational demands were elevated due to wartime conditions. The USS Cyclops moved within this framework as part of a predictable and documented sequence of naval logistics, where each stage of its journey was expected to be confirmed through structured reporting. American naval authorities during 1918 also faced growing anxiety over the vulnerability of Atlantic shipping routes as German submarine warfare continued threatening both military and commercial traffic. Although no confirmed enemy encounter involving the USS Cyclops was ever established, the wartime atmosphere surrounding the Atlantic contributed heavily to later speculation about the disappearance. Every unexplained interruption in naval communication during this period carried strategic implications because supply losses could affect operational readiness across entire sectors of the war effort. The USS Cyclops departed Barbados in March 1918, carrying a full cargo load intended for delivery to naval facilities in Baltimore. Its departure was recorded under standard wartime procedures, with no documented irregularities in loading operations or immediate mechanical concerns noted at the time. The vessel left port as expected, entering open Atlantic waters along a route that had been used repeatedly for similar supply missions, and nothing in its departure profile suggested deviation from established operational norms. Departure documentation confirmed that the vessel was operating under standard wartime procedures, with no recorded mechanical irregularities noted at the time of leaving port. At this stage, the USS Cyclops was functioning within normal operational expectations, and no external indicators suggested deviation from its planned course. Its progression into the Atlantic was initially treated as routine continuation of established supply movement, tracked only through the expected cadence of naval reporting intervals. The cargo carried aboard the USS Cyclops during its final voyage has remained a significant point of later investigation, because the vessel was reportedly transporting a large load of manganese ore in addition to other operational materials. Manganese was strategically valuable during wartime industrial production, particularly in steel manufacturing, yet its density also raised later questions regarding balance, cargo distribution, and structural stress aboard the ship. Some investigators later considered whether improper loading conditions may have affected the vessel's stability under difficult sea conditions, though no surviving evidence could conclusively confirm this possibility. Crew and passenger records associated with the USS Cyclops reflected the complexity of wartime naval movement during this period, with hundreds of personnel aboard at the time of departure. The disappearance therefore represented not only the loss of a major vessel, but one of the largest non-combat losses of life in United States naval history. The sheer number of missing individuals intensified the scale of the mystery, because an event large enough to destroy the ship should reasonably have produced some surviving evidence within the Atlantic corridor it travelled through. Radio communication aboard naval transport vessels of this size followed structured reporting protocols that required position confirmations at designated stages of the voyage. These systems were designed to maintain continuous awareness of vessel location across long distances, where direct visual tracking was impossible, relying instead on scheduled wireless updates that formed a consistent operational map of movement. The USS Cyclops operated within this framework, expected to report its status as it moved between established navigation points across the Atlantic. The USS Cyclops transmitted its final confirmed radio message while en route through the Atlantic, reporting routine operational status without indication of distress or deviation. This transmission was recorded as part of standard naval communication procedure, confirming expected progress along its assigned route and aligning with established reporting structure. Nothing in the message suggested mechanical failure, environmental threat, or operational disruption at the time it was sent, and it was logged as an ordinary continuation of voyage communication. This final transmission was logged as consistent with standard reporting format, reflecting expected position confirmation rather than emergency communication. In naval communication systems of the period, such messages were procedural, designed to maintain operational oversight rather than signal urgency or distress. The USS Cyclops' final report therefore existed as a routine data point within a structured chain of logistical verification, indistinguishable in tone from countless other messages sent across the Atlantic supply network. Wireless communication technology during the First World War still operated within limitations that made long-range maritime tracking dependent on intermittent reporting rather than constant monitoring. Operators aboard naval vessels transmitted updates through systems vulnerable to atmospheric conditions, signal interference, and range limitations across open ocean sectors. Even so, the structured nature of naval reporting meant that the complete disappearance of communication from a vessel as large as the USS Cyclops, was regarded as highly abnormal within operational command structures. Subsequent communication windows scheduled for the USS Cyclops were never fulfilled, creating an immediate gap in expected naval reporting sequences. The absence was first recognized not through dramatic alarm, but through the failure of routine confirmation at predetermined intervals that had previously been consistent throughout the voyage. Within a system built on predictability and scheduled reporting, even a single missing update introduced operational uncertainty that required immediate verification. Naval tracking procedures at the time initiated preliminary checks when scheduled transmissions failed to arrive within established operational timeframes. These checks involved verification of last known position, expected course progression, cargo status, and environmental conditions along the vessel's projected route. The USS Cyclops, however, did not reappear within any subsequent communication cycle, and no alternate transmission was received through adjacent naval channels or relay stations. Despite initial verification attempts, no additional radio contact was ever re-established with the USS Cyclops after its final transmission. The absence of follow-up communication marked a complete break in the vessel's recorded operational continuity, leaving only its last confirmed position as the final anchor point in naval records. From that moment forward, the ship existed solely within documentation that could no longer extend its narrative beyond a single recorded moment. Naval officials initially considered the possibility that communication delays or route deviations had interrupted the vessel's expected reporting schedule. Wartime conditions occasionally produced irregular movement patterns due to weather, operational rerouting, or wireless limitations, meaning immediate assumptions of total loss were avoided during the earliest stages of concern. As additional time passed without confirmed contact, however, the disappearance increasingly resisted ordinary logistical explanations. Search operations were organized across multiple Atlantic sectors as naval authorities attempted to reconstruct the vessel's last confirmed position. These efforts reflected the scale of uncertainty introduced by the disappearance of such a large and strategically important ship, requiring coordination across multiple naval assets and reconnaissance routes. The USS Cyclops remained the central reference point for all search coordination, yet no consistent trace of its path could be established despite expanded operational coverage. Coordinated fleet movements and reconnaissance efforts expanded outward from the USS Cyclops' projected route between Barbados and Baltimore, covering broad sections of the central and western Atlantic. Patrols scanned vast stretches of ocean in search of debris, survivors, or any visual confirmation that might indicate its fate. Despite extensive coverage and repeated sweeps of the expected corridor, no definitive evidence emerged to confirm its final condition or location. Maritime Patrol reports from the period recorded no confirmed debris fields or identifiable wreckage associated with the vessel's expected path. The absence of physical evidence complicated early assumptions about potential collision, weather loss, structural failure, or external interference. The USS Cyclops had not simply gone off course or delayed reporting, it had ceased to produce any traceable aftermath within the maritime environment it was expected to occupy. Hydrographic and weather assessments conducted after the disappearance failed to produce a single environmental explanation consistent with total vessel loss. Conditions along the route did not conclusively indicate a singular catastrophic event capable of explaining the complete absence of wreckage or distress confirmation. The USS Cyclops remained unaccounted for within both environmental and operational frameworks, leaving investigators without a unified physical or procedural explanation. The wartime context surrounding the disappearance inevitably fueled speculation involving enemy action, including the possibility of submarine attack or covert interception. German naval records examined after the war, however, failed to produce verified evidence linking enemy forces to the disappearance of the USS Cyclops. The absence of attack claims, debris, or survivor accounts weakened such theories without fully eliminating them from public discussion. Investigative reviews of the USS Cyclops case highlighted discrepancies between its confirmed final communication and the complete absence of subsequent trace evidence. The contradiction between structured naval tracking and total disappearance became the defining feature of the inquiry, as a vessel that was properly logged, properly communicated and properly routed still could not be located or reconstructed after its last message. This gap between recorded certainty and physical absence became central to every later analysis. Theories surrounding the disappearance often returned to structural load conditions, potential weather impacts, or unknown operational failures during transit. Some assessments considered the possibility of mechanical stress due to cargo distribution or shifting ballast, while others examined environmental conditions capable of rapid escalation in open ocean settings. Yet none of these explanations accounted fully for the absence of both wreckage and emergency communication beyond the final message, leaving each theory partially unresolved. Public fascination with the USS Cyclops later expanded beyond naval investigation into broader maritime mystery culture, particularly because the disappearance occurred within a region later associated with Bermuda Triangle mythology. Although the original naval investigations predated those later cultural narratives by decades, the unexplained nature of the loss allowed the vessel to become absorbed into wider speculation about disappearances in the Atlantic. This transformation gradually shifted public attention away from wartime logistics and toward the enduring image of a massive ship vanishing without warning after routine communication ceased. Every analytical reconstruction of the USS Cyclops voyage ultimately encounters the same unresolved break between its final confirmed transmission and all remaining recorded history. The ship exists within records as fully accounted for up to a precise moment, after which no system, report or observation continues its narrative in any recoverable form. The USS Cyclops becomes defined not by what was lost in motion, but by the point at which all documentation stops extending forward. The last recorded message from the USS Cyclops remains fixed in naval logs exactly as it was transmitted, followed by a voyage that no archive, report or recovered account has ever been able to continue beyond that final confirmed point, the MV Derbyshire and the last weather reports before the typhoon. Global bulk carrier operations in the late 20th century relied on massive steel-hulled vessels engineered to withstand extended transoceanic voyages under heavily monitored commercial shipping schedules. These ships were not experimental designs, but highly standardized components of international trade, each one integrated into a system where cargo weight, route efficiency, and timing precision determine profitability and operational safety. Within this framework, the MV Derbyshire stood as one of the most advanced examples of its class, representing both the scale and ambition of modern maritime engineering at the time. International freight routes across the Western Pacific and Indian Ocean were structured around forecast-driven planning systems that integrated meteorological data into daily navigation decisions. Unlike earlier maritime eras where weather was inferred or observed locally, shipping in 1980 relied on increasingly coordinated global forecasting networks that attempted to anticipate storm development across vast ocean regions. The MV Derbyshire moved within this system of prediction and adjustment, where course planning was continuously refined according to evolving atmospheric conditions. Typhoon monitoring networks operating in 1980 tracked developing storm systems with increasing precision, providing vessels with continuous updates on atmospheric pressure shifts and projected storm paths. These systems were designed to reduce uncertainty at sea, allowing large commercial vessels to alter routes in response to intensifying weather conditions. Typhoon Orchid, which would later become central to the disappearance of the MV Derbyshire, was one such system under observation as it gained strength across the Pacific Basin. The MV Derbyshire entered service as Britain's largest merchant vessel of its class, designed specifically for transporting bulk cargo across long-distance global trade corridors. Its structure reflected decades of engineering refinement in bulk carrier design, emphasizing cargo capacity, hull strength, and fuel efficiency over extended voyages. At the time of its final journey, the vessel was operating as part of a global logistics chain that depended on the uninterrupted movement of raw materials between continents. Voyage planning for the MV Derbyshire during its final journey incorporated standard weather routing procedures that accounted for seasonal storm activity in the region. These procedures were not optional, but embedded into maritime operational protocols, requiring ships to adjust course based on updated meteorological forecasts. The vessel's route was therefore shaped not only by commercial destination requirements, but also by continuous evaluation of environmental risk factors along its path. Meteorological advisories issued during the development of Typhoon Orchid indicated intensifying wind patterns and rapidly changing sea surface conditions across the vessel's projected path. These advisories were part of a broader forecasting system that tracked storm evolution across multiple observational platforms. The MV Derbyshire continued its voyage within this dynamic environment, where conditions could shift from manageable to extreme within relatively short time intervals. The MV Derbyshire transmitted routine communications during its passage, including standard weather observations consistent with expected reporting procedures for large commercial vessels. These messages formed part of a global exchange of environmental data that allowed meteorological agencies and shipping coordinators to maintain awareness of oceanic conditions. Nothing within these transmissions suggested deviation from normal operational status, and the vessel remained fully engaged in standard reporting cycles. These weather-related messages described ordinary maritime conditions at sea, reflecting operational continuity rather than any indication of structural distress or emergency escalation. In the language of maritime communication, such reports were procedural and informational, intended to contribute to broader weather mapping efforts rather than signal onboard concern. The MV Derbyshire functioned as a moving observation platform within this system, relaying environmental data as it progressed through the storm-affected region. Radio traffic from the MV Derbyshire remained consistent with standard shipping protocols until the final recorded weather updates were transmitted ahead of the typhoon's most severe phase. At this stage, the vessel was still operating within expected parameters, and no disruption in communication structure had been recorded. The final sequence of messages remained indistinguishable in tone from earlier transmissions, reinforcing the appearance of operational normality. Meteorological reporting systems at the time relied on vessel-based observations to supplement satellite and shore-based tracking of rapidly evolving storm systems. Ships like the MV Derbyshire played a critical role in refining storm models by providing real-time data from within affected regions. This integration of human observation and emerging satellite technology created a layered understanding of weather systems that depended heavily on uninterrupted communication from vessels at sea. The MV Derbyshire transmitted its final confirmed weather-related communication while still operating under normal navigational conditions within the storm's developing outer bands. This message formed part of routine environmental reporting, consistent with established maritime procedures for monitoring sea state and atmospheric behaviour. No distress signal accompanied the transmission, and no alteration in reporting format suggested impending emergency. This last message contained routine environmental data consistent with standard maritime reporting, without deviation into distress signalling or emergency classification. It represented the final confirmed point of contact between the vessel and global tracking systems, marking the end of its recorded operational communication. From that moment forward, the MV Derbyshire ceased to produce any further updates, despite being expected to continue regular reporting as it progressed along its route. No subsequent communications were received from the MV Derbyshire after its final weather report entered the global maritime tracking network. The absence was initially treated as a delayed reporting interval, as storm conditions could interfere with transmission clarity or timing. However, as additional communication windows passed without confirmation, the lack of contact became increasingly significant within operational monitoring systems. Search coordination efforts initiated following the communication gap were shaped by rapidly deteriorating weather conditions across the typhoon-affected region. Rescue and reconnaissance operations were immediately constrained by the same environmental system believed to have affected the vessel. The MV Derbyshire remained the central reference point for all search planning, yet its projected location became increasingly difficult to isolate within shifting storm dynamics. Ocean surface observations conducted in the aftermath of typhoon, ORCID revealed no immediate debris field consistent with a gradual structural breakdown of a vessel of that scale. This absence of visible wreckage complicated early assumptions about the sequence of events leading to its disappearance. The MV Derbyshire had not simply been delayed or displaced, it had left behind no recoverable surface trace within the expected search corridor. Engineering assessments conducted after the disappearance focused on the structural vulnerabilities of large bulk carriers exposed to extreme wave impact conditions. These studies examined how modern vessel design, while highly efficient under normal conditions, could be compromised under rare but extreme combinations of wave height, directionality and frequency. The MV Derbyshire became a central case study in understanding how structural integrity could fail under conditions that exceeded design expectations. Investigative conclusions highlighted how certain combinations of wave frequency, hull stress and cargo distribution could produce instantaneous structural failure scenarios in modern vessels. In such scenarios, failure would not necessarily produce prolonged distress signals or extended survival time, but rather rapid and total loss of structural cohesion. The MV Derbyshire was increasingly understood within this framework of abrupt environmental overload rather than gradual mechanical decline. Every reconstruction of the MV Derbyshire's final hours ultimately returns to the same point where ordinary weather reporting ceased without any transitional signal of structural failure. The vessel had continued to function within expected communication systems until the final confirmed message, after which no intermediary stage could be verified or reconstructed. Between the last recorded weather update and the absence that followed, there remains only an unbroken discontinuity that no subsequent analysis has ever been able to bridge. The last weather report from the MV Derbyshire was recorded as routine and complete, followed by a vessel that never appeared again in any operational record of the ocean it had just reported on. The CAS-2 and the radio that kept running. Small recreational catamaran designs operating along Australia's eastern coastline in the early 21st century were commonly used for short-range coastal cruising and offshore leisure navigation under predictable maritime conditions. These vessels were typically designed for stability, efficiency, and ease of handling rather than long-distance endurance, reflecting a growing recreational sailing culture in Queensland's coastal waters. Within this environment, small multi-hull craft like catamarans represented a balance between accessibility and seaworthiness, operating under the assumption that coastal conditions, while variable, remained within manageable limits for experienced crews. Queensland's offshore waters present a navigational environment where currents, reef systems and tidal shifts require consistent monitoring, even for experienced small vessel crews. The presence of the Great Barrier Reef system introduces complex navigational constraints where shallow passages and shifting sand formations can alter safe routes over relatively short distances. Even in calm weather, these waters demand attention to detail, as conditions can change rapidly, depending on wind direction, tidal movement, and localized weather patterns. Maritime tracking systems used in Australian coastal waters during this period recorded routine vessel movements through scheduled departures and expected coastal communication intervals. Small recreational vessels were often tracked through a combination of port departure logs, voluntary radio check-ins, and coastal observation systems designed to ensure safety in commonly used navigation corridors. Within this framework, the CAS-2 entered recorded maritime awareness as a routine coastal voyage rather than an unusual or high-risk operation. The CAS-2 was a small catamaran that departed on a coastal voyage off the Queensland shoreline in April 2007 with 3 experienced crew members on board. The vessel was not classified as an industrial or commercial transport ship, but rather a privately operated recreational craft used for coastal cruising. Its departure followed expected procedures for small vessel navigation, with no recorded irregularities in its condition or intended route at the time it left port. Departure records indicate that the CAS-2 was operating under normal recreational cruising conditions, with no reported mechanical faults or communication irregularities prior to its final contact. The vessel's planned movement along the coastline reflected standard coastal navigation practice, where experienced crews rely on weather awareness and visual navigation to maintain safe passage. At this stage, nothing in the recorded documentation suggested deviation from expected operational behaviour. The final confirmed communication associated with the CAS-2 occurred during what was described as a routine phase of its intended coastal journey. This message formed the last verified human contact within maritime tracking systems before the vessel's presence became unaccounted for in subsequent reporting intervals. The tone and content of the communication did not indicate distress or emergency conditions, instead aligning with standard operational reporting. This last recorded message from the CAS-2 was consistent with standard maritime contact procedures and contained no indication of distress or abnormal vessel behaviour. In coastal navigation systems, such communications are typically procedural, confirming position, conditions, or general status during transit. The CAS-2's final transmission therefore existed as a routine point of contact within an otherwise ordinary voyage sequence. Following this final communication, no additional human contact was recorded from the CAS-2 within expected reporting or tracking systems. The absence was initially interpreted as a possible delay in communication, since small recreational vessels do not always maintain continuous radio contact. However, as time progressed without further confirmation, the lack of response became increasingly significant within search coordination protocols. Search operations initiated after the communication gap followed established coastal recovery protocols used in Australian maritime monitoring zones. These procedures included aerial surveillance, coastal scanning, and coordinated maritime patrol efforts designed to locate vessels that had failed to report in expected intervals. The CAS-2 quickly became the central focus of these operations, with search patterns expanding along predicted drift and route trajectories. Aerial reconnaissance and maritime patrols eventually located the CAS-2 drifting offshore near the Great Barrier Reef region under calm sea conditions. The discovery was notable not because of damage or wreckage, but because the vessel appeared structurally intact while lacking visible signs of its crew. Its position in open water suggested it had remained afloat and stable despite the absence of human presence on board. Initial visual confirmation of the CAS-2 revealed a vessel that appeared structurally intact and stable, despite the absence of any visible crew on board. There were no immediate indications of collision damage, fire or storm-related destruction that could account for abandonment or loss of personnel. The catamaran appeared to be drifting in a controlled manner, influenced only by wind and current. Further examination of the drifting catamaran showed that onboard systems were still operational at the time of discovery. This condition introduced an unusual paradox, where a vessel designed for human operation continued functioning without any visible operator presence. The CAS-2 was not disabled or inert. It remained active within its mechanical and electrical systems. The CAS-2's engines were reportedly running when the vessel was first boarded by search personnel. This observation added another layer of complexity to the investigation, as engine operation typically requires either manual control or pre-programmed system engagement under specific conditions. The continued activity of propulsion systems suggested that the vessel had not been forcibly disabled before abandonment. Inside the vessel, investigators observed signs of routine activity, including food that appeared recently prepared but left unattended. These findings indicated that normal onboard processes had been underway shortly before discovery, reinforcing the impression that the disappearance of the crew occurred without extended shutdown or gradual evacuation. The presence of such conditions created a striking contrast between normal activity and sudden absence. Communication equipment aboard the CAS-2 was found to be functioning despite the absence of any crew to operate it. The radio system remained operational, capable of transmitting signals, yet no one remained on board to initiate or respond to communication attempts. This detail became central to later interpretations of the incident, as it suggested continuity of function without human control. Maritime investigators documented the unusual condition of a vessel maintaining active operational status without any human presence on board. The CAS-2 did not present as a wreck or abandoned shell, but rather as a functioning system left in motion without guidance. This distinction separated it from traditional maritime disappearances involving damage, sinking, or catastrophic failure. Subsequent analysis of the CAS-2 case focused on how onboard systems could remain active while standard crew oversight was no longer present. Investigators considered factors such as automatic system settings, engine behavior under idle conditions, and the possibility of unintended mechanical continuation after departure of personnel. Yet no single explanation fully accounted for the combination of active systems and missing crew. Official reviews of the incident highlighted the absence of any confirmed distress signal or mechanical failure capable of explaining the sudden disappearance of all 3 crew members. No emergency transmission was received from the CAS-2 at any point following its final confirmed communication, and no external evidence suggested a collision or rapid sinking event. The vessel's condition contradicted expectations of how a maritime emergency would normally present itself. The CAS-2's radio remained operational and ready to transmit long after its last human communication, continuing to register activity from a vessel that no one was left aboard to guide. The MV Salem Express and the calls beneath the Red Sea. Ferry passengers moving across the Red Sea in the late hours of night crossings between Egypt and the Arabian Peninsula were often guided by a familiar rhythm of boarding, departure announcements, and the steady pull away from illuminated ports fading into open water. These crossings formed part of a routine maritime movement that connected coastal communities on both sides of the sea, where travel was frequent, predictable, and structured around established ferry schedules. The MV Salem Express operated within this same familiar pattern, carrying passengers through a route that was well known to regional navigation systems and regularly used in commercial passenger transport. The passage between Safaga and destinations across the eastern Red Sea was a heavily used corridor where navigation depended on aligning vessel movement with known coastal landmarks and reef-marked warnings rather than deep ocean tracking systems. Unlike open sea voyages that rely on broad directional plotting, these crossings required close attention to coastal geography, where even small deviations could bring a vessel into proximity with submerged hazards. The MV Salem Express followed this corridor as part of its scheduled passage, moving through waters that were familiar but structurally complex in terms of underwater terrain. Dark reef formations beneath the surface near the Straits of Gabal created a navigational zone where even minor positional deviation could shift a vessel from safe water into hazardous contact with submerged structures. These formations were not unknown to maritime operators, but their exact positioning demanded precision, particularly during nighttime crossings when visual depth perception was limited. The presence of these underwater structures created a narrow operational margin for large passenger ferries transiting the area. On the night of the crossing in 1991, the MV Salem Express carried passengers across this corridor as it continued its scheduled journey toward the Egyptian mainland. The vessel was operating under normal conditions for a ferry of its type, with no documented irregularities in its departure or early transit phase. As it moved further along its route, it entered the final segment of its journey, where coastal proximity and reef density increased navigational sensitivity. Onboard activity followed standard ferry conditions during transit, with passengers occupying decks and interior spaces as the vessel moved through familiar waters approaching the final coastal segment of its route. The movement of the ship at this stage reflected routine maritime behaviour, with no recorded indication that anything unusual had yet occurred. In maritime terms, this was still a controlled passage within expected operational parameters, where communication and navigation remained aligned with established procedures. As the vessel advanced deeper into the reef-marked approach zone, the surrounding navigational environment became increasingly confined by underwater formations that limited safe directional adjustment. This narrowing corridor required precise alignment, particularly as the vessel approached areas where submerged structures rose sharply from the seabed. The MV Salem Express was now operating within one of the most restricted sections of its route, where timing and positioning became critical factors in maintaining safe passage. The last confirmed radio communication from the MV Salem Express was transmitted during this final approach phase, when the vessel was still functioning under normal operational conditions. This transmission represented the final verified point of contact between the ship and coastal monitoring systems before any disruption was recorded. At the time it was sent, there was no indication within the message that the vessel was experiencing emergency conditions or structural failure. That final transmission contained routine navigational information consistent with standard ferry reporting, without any formal indication that an emergency situation had yet developed. In the structure of maritime communication, such messages typically serve as positional or status updates, rather than distress signals, and the MV Salem Express followed this established format in its last recorded exchange. Nothing within the content of the transmission suggested that conditions were about to change abruptly. Moments after this final exchange, the vessel's recorded communication pattern began to fragment, with signals becoming less complete as conditions on board changed rapidly. This fragmentation marked the beginning of a transition from structured communication to incomplete transmission, where messages no longer reached shore stations in full form. The MV Salem Express was still transmitting, but the integrity of those transmissions began to deteriorate within a very short time frame. Radio channels capturing distress activity began receiving broken transmissions that suggested emergency procedures were being attempted but not completed. These fragments indicated that communication was still active on board, but external reception systems were only able to capture partial sequences before interruption occurred. The nature of these transmissions reflected a rapidly developing situation in which standard reporting could no longer be maintained in full form. Messages from the MV Salem Express arrived in incomplete sections, with interruptions cutting off information before full situation reports could be delivered. This pattern of fragmentation suggested that communication was not entirely lost at once, but instead degraded in stages as onboard conditions evolved. Each fragment represented an attempt to transmit information that was never fully completed. Accounts from survivors describe sudden instability on board that aligned with the same narrow time frame in which radio communication began to fail. These testimonies provide a human perspective on the final moments of the vessel, describing rapid shifts in movement and structural behaviour that coincided with the breakdown of communication systems. The MV Salem Express was no longer operating under stable conditions at this stage, and the ability to coordinate onboard activity diminished quickly. Water ingress following the reef impact progressed rapidly through lower vessel sections, reducing the time available for coordinated movement across decks. This structural breach introduced immediate flooding into areas that were critical for maintaining stability, accelerating the transition from controlled operation to emergency conditions. The speed of this process significantly reduced the window in which communication and evacuation procedures could be completed. Rescue coordination efforts were initiated while fragments of communication were still being received from the sinking vessel. This overlap between distress reception and response deployment created a narrow and unstable timeline in which information continued to arrive, even as the situation was already unfolding beyond control. The MV Salem Express remained partially in contact with external systems, even as its physical condition deteriorated. Post-incident analysis focused on the interaction between hull structure and reef, impact angles that could produce immediate breach conditions in large passenger ferries. Investigators examined how the geometry of the seabed and vessel trajectory could combine to create rapid and concentrated structural damage. The MV Salem Express became a reference point in understanding how reef collisions can produce sudden and extensive flooding in large passenger vessels. The interval between first impact and total communication loss was later identified as significantly shorter than standard emergency response procedures are designed to accommodate. This time, compression meant that even established maritime safety protocols were unable to fully engage before communication systems ceased functioning. The MV Salem Express incident highlighted how rapidly structured maritime operations can collapse when environmental forces exceed expected thresholds. What distinguished the MV Salem Express incident was not the absence of communication, but the inability for communication to complete its normal cycle before physical conditions overtook it. The vessel continued to transmit during the critical transition from stability to failure, but those transmissions were progressively interrupted until only fragments remained. This created a scenario where communication existed, but never reached completion. In the final recorded sequence, only partial transmission data remained before the channel itself ceased to carry any further information. These final fragments marked the end of all recoverable communication from the vessel, leaving only incomplete records of a situation that had already moved beyond the reach of external systems. The last fragments transmitted from the MV Salem Express ended without completion, leaving only an active signal window that no longer contained anything to finish speaking. The SS Waratah and the signals heard after the disappearance. Grey winter light spreading across the waters off South Africa often reduced entire passenger liners to distant silhouettes, moving through haze before disappearing completely behind weather and sea. Mariners operating between Durban and Cape Town understood that ships travelling this corridor could vanish from visual range for long periods even under ordinary conditions, swallowed temporarily by mist, rain bands, and unstable southern swells. In the early 20th century, before reliable long-distance tracking systems existed, the ocean between ports remained large enough for uncertainty to develop quickly once communication slowed or visual confirmation failed. Cold swells moving along the South African coastline between Durban and Cape Town created one of the longest uninterrupted maritime stretches regularly travelled by passenger liners in the early 20th century. The route carried commercial ships through waters that could appear calm for hours before shifting into heavy weather with little visible warning, particularly during the southern winter months when visibility often dissolved into low cloud, mist, and sea haze. Ships crossing this corridor frequently disappeared from sight, not because they had vanished, but because the scale of the ocean between ports reduced them to isolated moving lights surrounded by immense distance. Far beyond visual range of the coast, vessels crossing this route often disappeared into weatherbanks and sea haze for days before their next confirmed sighting. Communication during this period relied heavily on scheduled arrivals, visual confirmation from passing ships, and the growing but still limited use of wireless technology aboard major liners. A ship leaving one harbour could move into an enormous stretch of ocean where almost nothing existed between departure and destination except open sea, uncertain weather and whatever messages operators managed to send or receive through unstable atmospheric conditions. Winter conditions in the southern waters off Africa could alter rapidly, producing rough visibility and unstable seas that complicated both navigation and later recovery efforts. The waters between Durban and Cape Town were already known among mariners for heavy swells and abrupt weather changes that could challenge even experienced crews. In an era before satellite monitoring or modern search coordination systems, storms moving across these routes often existed beyond precise observation once ships disappeared over the horizon. Commercial shipping routes linking Australia, South Africa and Britain during this period formed part of a vast imperial transportation network responsible for moving passengers, cargo and communication across enormous distances. Passenger liners travelling these routes carried businessmen, migrants, mail and commercial goods through interconnected maritime corridors that were considered essential to international trade. The disappearance of any major vessel along these routes therefore attracted attention not only because of the lives aboard, but because the shipping system itself depended heavily on predictability and continuity. The SS Waratah departed during this period as part of its scheduled passenger and cargo service, operating between Australia, South Africa and London. Built as a large steam-powered liner intended for long-distance commercial routes, the vessel represented a growing class of modern passenger ships designed to move people and cargo efficiently across imperial maritime corridors. By 1909, the SS Waratah had already completed several voyage segments before beginning the portion of its journey that would later become one of Australia's most enduring maritime mysteries. Passengers boarding the SS Waratah entered what was expected to be another routine stage of a long commercial voyage through heavily travelled maritime corridors. The liner carried travellers, cargo and mail across routes considered essential to communication and commerce between continents. Nothing about the vessel's scheduled departure suggested that it would soon disappear so completely that not even confirmed wreckage would ever be recovered. Accounts connected to passengers aboard the SS Waratah later became an important part of the mystery, because several individuals reportedly expressed unease regarding the vessel's movement during rough weather. Some later recollections described heavy rolling or instability during portions of the voyage, though these accounts varied in detail and could not establish a definitive structural problem. Even so, later investigators repeatedly returned to these descriptions, while attempting to determine whether the ship may have encountered stability issues severe enough to contribute to disaster conditions in heavy seas. Reports from the vessel's earlier voyage segments described the liner as operational and active, despite occasional concerns raised about stability during rough sea conditions. Some passengers and crew members reportedly commented on the ship's movement in heavy seas, although no definitive structural fault was officially established before the disappearance. The SS Waratah continued its scheduled operations regardless, moving through ports and departure sequences as expected for a liner of its class. The final confirmed contact involving the SS Waratah occurred after the vessel departed Durban and continued southwest along the South African coast. At this stage, the liner was expected to proceed toward Cape Town as part of its established route. The ship remained fully integrated within ordinary maritime operations, and no emergency condition had yet been publicly identified. This last verified communication from the SS Waratah reflected ordinary voyage continuity rather than distress or emergency signalling. In the context of early 20th century maritime travel, such communication often consisted of routine contact, confirming movement and operational status rather than detailed ongoing reporting. The vessel therefore disappeared not after a dramatic distress message, but after what appeared to be a normal continuation of its voyage. Early wireless systems aboard passenger liners during this era still represented relatively new maritime technology, and communication practices varied depending on equipment capability, operator experience, and atmospheric conditions. Signals transmitted over long distances could weaken, overlap, or distort as they crossed unstable weather systems and crowded shipping corridors. Operators working these systems frequently depended on interpretation and timing as much as signal clarity itself, meaning that uncertainty was built into the communication environment surrounding vessels like the SS Waratah. Days passed without the vessel arriving at Cape Town, gradually transforming a delayed schedule into one of the largest maritime search concerns in the region. At first, uncertainty surrounding arrival times left open the possibility that weather or navigational delays had interrupted the schedule. As additional time passed without confirmed sightings, however, the absence of the SS Waratah became increasingly difficult to explain within ordinary operational expectations. Search vessels scanning the expected route encountered open water conditions that revealed no confirmed debris field or visible trace of the missing liner. The ocean corridor between Durban and Cape Town was vast enough that even concentrated search efforts could leave enormous sections effectively unexamined. Ships participating in recovery attempts moved through rough seas and unstable visibility conditions without locating definitive evidence of the vessel's fate. Shipping traffic moving through the same corridor continued reporting negative sightings of the SS Waratah, despite increasing awareness of the disappearance. Merchant vessels, passenger liners, and regional maritime operators scanned the route where the ship was expected to appear, yet none reported confirmed visual contact after its departure from Durban. The liner seemed to have vanished into one of the busiest maritime corridors in the Southern Hemisphere without leaving behind the physical evidence usually associated with a major maritime loss. Maritime authorities and shipping companies faced growing pressure to explain how a modern passenger liner carrying both passengers and cargo could disappear so completely along a commercially active route. The lack of debris complicated even the most basic reconstruction efforts because investigators could not identify whether the ship had encountered collision, capsizing, structural failure, or severe weather damage. Without wreckage, the SS Waratah became a disappearance defined almost entirely through absence rather than physical evidence. Rumours surrounding the fate of the vessel expanded quickly as the absence of wreckage left investigators without a confirmed explanation for the loss. Without a visible disaster site, speculation began filling the empty space left by missing evidence. Storm conditions, structural instability, rogue waves, and navigational error all emerged as possible explanations, yet none could be verified through recovered material or direct witness testimony. Wireless operators working long-distance maritime frequencies during the months following the disappearance occasionally reported unusual signals believed by some to be linked to the missing ship. These reports emerged during a period when wireless communication technology was still developing, and operators frequently worked under difficult atmospheric conditions that distorted or fragmented transmissions. The idea that the SS Waratah might still somehow be transmitting after its disappearance quickly became one of the most unsettling aspects of the mystery. Static-heavy transmissions received during nighttime monitoring periods created uncertainty over whether certain call patterns were genuine communications or atmospheric interference. Early wireless systems lacked the precision and clarity associated with modern communication equipment, making signal interpretation heavily dependent on operator experience and environmental conditions. In some cases, fragments of transmissions could appear recognizable even when their origin remained impossible to verify. Several accounts described fragmented wireless traffic that operators associated with the SS Waratah. Although no report was ever fully verified through official confirmation systems, some operators believed they had intercepted call signs or transmission fragments that resembled signals connected to the missing liner, while others argued these reports reflected misidentification or signal overlap from unrelated vessels. The uncertainty surrounding these alleged transmissions prevented them from ever being treated as confirmed evidence, yet they continued circulating through maritime discussion for years afterward. Nighttime wireless monitoring during the early 20th century often produced an atmosphere of uncertainty among operators stationed alone beside radio equipment for extended periods. Signals could emerge briefly through static before fading without confirmation, while atmospheric disturbances sometimes carried transmissions across unexpected distances. In that environment, the possibility that fragments linked to the SS Waratah were still appearing after the disappearance became psychologically powerful even without official verification. Early 20th century radio technology operated within limitations that made long-range signal identification difficult under unstable atmospheric conditions. Wireless communication at sea often involved competing transmissions crossing large distances through atmospheric layers capable of bending, weakening, or distorting signals in unpredictable ways. Operators sometimes heard fragments that seemed to emerge briefly from static before disappearing again, leaving uncertainty about both content and origin. Passing vessels and coastal stations sometimes intercepted unidentified transmissions whose origins could not be conclusively traced across the crowded wireless environment of the era. In the years following the disappearance, stories continued to emerge describing signals that some believed originated from the SS Waratah. Whether these reports reflected genuine unexplained transmissions, ordinary signal confusion, or the psychological influence of an unresolved maritime disaster remained impossible to determine conclusively. Search efforts and later expeditions attempting to locate the wreck of the SS Waratah continued intermittently across decades, driven partly by advances in maritime survey technology and partly by enduring public fascination with the case. Several proposed wreck discoveries emerged over time, yet none achieved universal confirmation as the missing liner. The ship therefore remained suspended between documented history and unresolved legend, never fully returning from the waters where it disappeared. What made the SS Waratah case especially enduring was the growing belief that the vanished liner might still have been attempting to communicate after it had already disappeared from every known route. This transformed the mystery from a conventional maritime disappearance into something more unsettling within public imagination. The ship no longer existed solely as a lost vessel, but as a possible source of unanswered signals drifting through the early wireless age. Decades of investigation failed to produce confirmed wreckage capable of resolving whether the reported post-disappearance signals had any connection to the missing vessel at all. Searches continued across different periods of the 20th century, yet no universally accepted discovery of the wreck was ever confirmed. The SS Waratah remained suspended between recorded disappearance and unresolved speculation, preserved in maritime history as both a missing liner and a possible voice still being searched for long after the voyage ended. Long after the SS Waratah vanished beyond the South African horizon, operators still listened through bursts of static for signals they could never fully prove had stopped coming from the ship. The Andrea Gale and the final words inside the perfect storm. Salt residue hardened across rails, cables and fishing equipment aboard North Atlantic longliners that spent weeks moving through cold, offshore waters where exhaustion became part of ordinary routine. Crews working these fishing grounds operated within an industry shaped by physical endurance, uncertain profit margins, and constant exposure to dangerous weather systems that could shift without warning across open sea. Unlike large commercial cargo vessels built for stability over long-distance routes, fishing boats such as the Andrea Gale existed close to the surface of the ocean itself, reacting immediately to every swell, wind change and pressure shift moving beneath the hull. Steel fishing hooks laid across freezing North Atlantic waters formed part of a commercial sword fishing industry, where crews often remained at sea for extended periods under physically punishing conditions. Fishing boats operating along the Grand Banks and surrounding Atlantic regions depended on endurance, timing, and weather awareness as much as navigation itself, because profit often depended on remaining offshore long enough to secure a successful catch before returning to port. The vessels working these waters were not enormous cargo carriers or passenger liners built for stability across massive ocean routes, but compact commercial boats exposed directly to the movement of the sea around them. Every shift in weather could immediately alter the physical reality aboard the vessel, from deck movement to visibility and crew safety. Late-season fishing voyages along the Grand Banks and surrounding Atlantic regions exposed small commercial vessels to rapidly changing weather systems, moving across open ocean corridors. Autumn in the North Atlantic carried particular danger because seasonal transitions allowed separate atmospheric systems to collide with unusual intensity over open water. Crews operating in these areas understood that weather forecasts could deteriorate quickly, yet commercial pressure and long-distance fishing patterns often kept boats offshore even as conditions worsened. The ocean during this period became an unstable environment where cold air systems, wind fields, and heavy seas interacted continuously across enormous distances. Cold spray, unstable decks, and long operational hours shaped daily life aboard fishing boats like the Andrea Gale, where crews worked through conditions that larger vessels might avoid entirely. The Andrea Gale itself operated as a commercial fishing vessel based out of Gloucester, Massachusetts, a port historically tied to the dangerous realities of North Atlantic fishing culture. Life aboard such vessels revolved around labour-intensive routines performed in isolation, where communication with shore often remained limited to brief radio contact and operational updates transmitted between fishing grounds and coastal stations. Commercial fishing culture in Gloucester carried a long historical association with maritime loss, severe weather, and the economic pressures that pushed crews into increasingly dangerous conditions during late fishing seasons. Boats departing from the port often remained offshore for long stretches in pursuit of catches, large enough to justify fuel costs, equipment strain, and physical risk. For many crews, returning early because of worsening weather could mean financial failure after weeks already spent at sea, creating a working culture where difficult conditions were often accepted as unavoidable parts of survival within the industry. During October 1991, multiple atmospheric systems began converging across the North Atlantic, in a pattern that would later become widely known as the perfect storm. Meteorologists observed the interaction of a developing low-pressure system, cold air movement, and the remnants of Hurricane Grace, creating a rare and increasingly unstable weather configuration. What made the developing storm especially dangerous was not simply its strength, but the way several independent systems reinforced one another across the same ocean region occupied by commercial fishing vessels. Meteorological reports issued during the early stages of the developing storm described intensifying seas and unstable pressure conditions spreading across heavily travelled fishing grounds. Forecasts warned of worsening wave conditions, increasing winds, and dangerous sea movement extending through major Atlantic operating corridors. The North Atlantic during these days transformed from difficult working water into an environment capable of overwhelming vessels built to survive rough conditions. Weather forecasting technology in 1991 allowed meteorologists to track major atmospheric developments more effectively than earlier generations of mariners could have imagined. Yet forecasting the exact interaction of multiple storm systems across the Atlantic remained deeply complicated. As pressure systems intensified and converged, updated reports began indicating the possibility of extraordinary sea conditions developing across broad sections of ocean occupied by commercial vessels. The scale of the emerging system gradually shifted concern from ordinary rough weather toward recognition that an unusually dangerous maritime event was forming offshore. Fishing vessels operating within the region began adjusting routes and discussing worsening weather conditions over maritime radio channels as the storm system expanded. Communication traffic reflected growing concern among crews attempting to interpret forecasts while balancing operational decisions about whether to continue fishing or return towards safer waters. These conversations formed a shared network of maritime awareness, where boats separated by distance still monitored the same developing threat through overlapping radio communication. The Andrea gale continued operating within this environment, while conditions across the North Atlantic became increasingly dangerous. Like many commercial fishing vessels working offshore, the boat remained exposed to a rapidly changing weather system, whose full severity was still developing. At this stage, the Andrea gale had not yet disappeared, but it was already moving inside a growing storm environment that other crews throughout the region were beginning to describe with increasing alarm. Radio communication from the Andrea gale during the voyage reflected standard operational contact during deteriorating weather conditions rather than immediate emergency signalling. The vessel remained active within ordinary maritime communication structures, transmitting routine updates consistent with fishing operations during unstable weather. Nothing in these earlier contacts definitively indicated that the Andrea gale was already beyond recovery. Fishing crews operating in the region during the storm frequently relied on radio communication not only for navigation and weather updates, but for psychological reassurance while isolated within dangerous sea conditions. Voices transmitted across maritime frequencies connected vessels scattered over enormous distances, allowing crews to exchange observations about wind direction, wave patterns, mechanical strain, and route decisions. During severe weather, these conversations became increasingly urgent because survival often depended on rapidly changing information shared between boats confronting the same ocean conditions. The vessel's final confirmed transmission occurred while surrounding ships were already reporting severe sea conditions developing throughout the region. This final communication became the last verified human contact from the Andrea gale before the vessel disappeared entirely within the expanding North Atlantic storm system. The message itself was not structured as a dramatic distress signal, but rather as part of the ongoing operational communication shared between vessels navigating increasingly violent conditions. This last communication from the Andrea gale contained no formal distress declaration, despite evidence that weather conditions were continuing to intensify rapidly. The absence of a clear mayday or catastrophic report has remained one of the enduring features of the case, because it suggests either that the vessel was still functioning at the time of transmission, or that conditions deteriorated too quickly afterward for additional communication to occur. the Andrea Gale effectively vanished in the narrow interval between ordinary operational contact and total disappearance. As the storm strengthened further, radio traffic across the North Atlantic became increasingly dominated by weather reports, navigation concerns, and survival-focused communication from nearby vessels. Ships throughout the region transmitted updates describing dangerous wave patterns, equipment strain, and rapidly declining sea conditions. The ocean no longer functioned as separate isolated routes, but as a shared disaster environment where crews attempted to track survival through overlapping radio exchanges. Crews aboard other fishing boats later described waves of unusual height and violent sea movement that disrupted both vessel control and communication stability. Surviving operators reported conditions severe enough to interfere with navigation, onboard operations, and even the ability to maintain stable radio contact. The scale of the storm created an atmosphere where every communication carried the tension of immediate survival rather than routine procedure. Several ships operating within the broader storm system transmitted urgent updates describing equipment strain, navigational difficulty, and worsening visibility conditions. Reports from nearby vessels described heavy seas capable of lifting boats into unstable positions before slamming them back into troughs surrounded by walls of water. These accounts later became some of the closest surviving descriptions of the environment that likely surrounded the Andrea Gale during its final hours. Maritime radio channels active during the storm carried overlapping voices from crews attempting to track changing weather patterns while maintaining position in extreme seas. Operators monitored transmissions from nearby vessels while struggling to manage their own navigation and survival concerns, creating a communication environment saturated with fragmented information and escalating urgency. Within this crowded radio landscape, the final words from the Andrea Gale gradually disappeared among the growing volume of storm-related communication. Accounts from surviving vessels revealed how quickly operational control could deteriorate once the storm reached its most violent phase. Boats capable of surviving ordinary North Atlantic conditions suddenly faced sea states beyond normal expectation, where equipment failure and loss of maneuverability became immediate threats. Some surviving crews later described conditions so extreme that even experienced mariners struggled to describe the movement of the ocean around them. Waves generated by the converging storm systems reportedly reached heights capable of overwhelming smaller commercial vessels within seconds, especially if equipment failure, flooding, or loss of engine power occurred simultaneously. In such conditions, the margin between survival and catastrophe narrowed dramatically, because even brief mechanical problems could leave a boat exposed broadside to violent seas. Investigators later examined whether sudden flooding, rogue waves, or destabilizing sea movement may have struck the Andrea Gale before the crew had sufficient time to transmit a distress call. Search operations initiated after the Andrea Gale failed to return focused on debris recovery across a vast area of North Atlantic water affected by the storm system. The scale of the ocean and the severity of conditions complicated recovery efforts, leaving investigators with limited physical evidence regarding the vessel's final moments. Search aircraft and recovery teams moved through an environment still shaped by the storm that had consumed the fishing boat. United States Coast Guard recovery efforts faced enormous logistical difficulty because the storm itself continued disrupting visibility, aircraft operations, and search coordination long after the Andrea Gale disappeared. Search teams worked across dangerous sea conditions while attempting to identify debris fields or survival evidence within an ocean corridor spanning immense distances. The same environmental forces believed responsible for the vessel's disappearance also complicated nearly every effort to determine what had happened afterward. Only limited physical evidence connected to the Andrea Gale was eventually recovered, leaving the vessel's final moments beyond direct reconstruction. Debris associated with the boat confirmed loss at sea, yet no survivor testimony or complete transmission record survived to explain precisely what happened during the final phase of the voyage. The disappearance therefore remained suspended between known environmental catastrophe and unknowable final detail. Investigations into the loss relied heavily on weather analysis, maritime communication records, and testimony from surviving crews who experienced the same storm from neighbouring sectors of the Atlantic. These accounts established the extraordinary severity of the conditions surrounding the Andrea Gale without resolving the exact sequence of events that destroyed the vessel. the fishing boat effectively vanished inside a storm environment so violent that even nearby survivors often struggled afterward to describe how close they themselves had come to disappearing. What remained instead were fragmented communications from surrounding ships whose crews survived long enough to describe the same conditions the Andrea Gale never emerged from. These transmissions became indirect witnesses to the disappearance, preserving descriptions of waves, wind, instability, and fear transmitted by people who experienced the storm from nearby waters, yet still managed to survive it. The Andrea Gale itself never transmitted beyond its final confirmed contact, leaving the surrounding voices to define the scale of the disaster that followed. The final words transmitted from the Andrea Gale disappeared into radio channels already crowded with storm reports from crews who survived just long enough to hear how dangerous the Atlantic had become. The RMS Naronic and the messages that never arrived. Beneath winter skies stretching unbroken between Liverpool and New York, steamships entering the North Atlantic often disappeared into distances so vast that weeks could pass before anyone realised something had gone wrong. The Atlantic crossing during the late 19th century carried an atmosphere unlike later eras of maritime travel because once a ship moved beyond the horizon, it effectively entered a world separated from land by silence, weather, and uncertainty. Passengers departing Europe understood that storms, ice, and mechanical failure remained constant risks. Yet the scale of the ocean created another danger entirely, one rooted not in violence alone but in the terrifying possibility that a ship could vanish without explanation, while the world ashore continued unaware for days. Unlike the wireless era that would soon redefine maritime safety, the Atlantic crossing in 1893 still depended largely on schedules, visual sightings, and the assumption that silence usually meant a ship was continuing forward somewhere beyond the horizon. Maritime communication systems during this period remained limited to harbour reports, signal flags, and direct encounters between vessels at sea, meaning no captain could instantly transmit distress once disaster unfolded beyond reach of land. A ship travelling westward from Britain therefore entered an enormous communication void where its survival depended almost entirely on its own ability to endure whatever conditions emerged across the ocean ahead. Constructed for the White Star Line's growing transatlantic operations, the RMS Naronic represented the industrial confidence of late 19th century shipping, built to carry cargo, cattle, and limited passengers across one of the busiest ocean corridors in the world. Completed only a short time before its disappearance, the vessel belonged to a generation of steamships intended to demonstrate the growing reliability and scale of modern maritime engineering. Its steel construction, large cargo capacity, and commercial purpose reflected an era increasingly convinced that industrial advancement had begun reducing the unpredictability that once dominated Atlantic travel. Passengers and crew aboard the RMS Naronic departed Liverpool in February 1893, expecting another ordinary Atlantic voyage, surrounded by routines so familiar that few would have considered the possibility of total disappearance. The vessel carried a relatively small number of passengers alongside a much larger crew and cargo load that included cattle intended for American markets. Ships like the RMS Naronic formed part of a constant commercial movement between Europe and North America, crossing routes so heavily travelled that complete disappearance still seemed improbable, despite the dangers of winter seas. Freight manifests and departure records preserved the ship in remarkable administrative detail, before the Atlantic erased nearly everything that followed afterward. Shipping companies during this period maintained careful documentation regarding cargo weight, departure schedules, crew assignments, and intended routes because transatlantic commerce depended on predictable coordination between ports. The RMS Naronic therefore entered the ocean as a fully documented vessel moving through structured commercial systems, yet after departure, nearly every trace of its continued existence dissolved into uncertainty. Cold season crossings during February routinely exposed transatlantic steamers to freezing spray, shifting visibility, and heavy seas capable of isolating vessels far beyond immediate assistance. North Atlantic winter conditions often developed unpredictably as low-pressure systems moved eastward across the ocean, generating waves and winds severe enough to challenge even large steam-powered ships. Ice drifting southward into shipping lanes also remained a persistent concern during colder months, particularly for vessels travelling through northern sections of established Atlantic routes. Far out beyond coastal traffic lanes, ships travelling westbound often entered stretches of ocean, where no meaningful communication with land existed once the shoreline disappeared behind them. Mariners navigating these waters relied heavily on dead reckoning, celestial navigation, weather observation, and estimated progress calculations that could become increasingly uncertain under poor conditions. If mechanical problems or environmental disaster struck during such periods, crews possessed almost no means of immediately alerting the outside world. No verified distress signal ever came from the RMS Naronic after it departed into the Atlantic, leaving investigators without even a single confirmed description of the emergency that may have unfolded aboard. This absence became one of the defining features of the mystery, because there existed no surviving witness account, no confirmed final sighting, and no direct explanation from anyone aboard the vessel itself. The RMS Naronic effectively vanished at the precise point where 19th century communication systems ended and open ocean silence began. Shipping offices waiting for the vessel's arrival initially treated the delay as a navigational interruption rather than evidence of catastrophe. Delays at sea were not uncommon during winter crossings, especially when weather systems slowed progress or forced ships to alter course temporarily. For a time, uncertainty surrounding the RMS Naronic remained manageable within ordinary commercial expectations, because no immediate evidence suggested the voyage had already ended in disaster somewhere beyond sight of land. Gradually, concern surrounding the RMS Naronic expanded through maritime networks as expected sightings failed to materialize along the ship's projected route toward New York. Harbour authorities, shipping agents, and other vessels crossing the Atlantic began exchanging inquiries regarding whether anyone had encountered the missing steamer during the voyage. Yet despite the density of transatlantic traffic during this era, no confirmed report emerged placing the vessel safely beyond the point of departure. Search discussions unfolding in newspapers and shipping circles revealed how little information could actually be gathered once a vessel vanished beyond visual range during the pre-radio era. Public understanding of maritime disappearance often relied heavily on rumour, fragmented sightings and speculation, because investigations possessed few direct tools capable of reconstructing events far offshore. The RMS Naronic therefore entered a growing space between official uncertainty and public imagination, where every possibility remained open precisely because almost nothing could be conclusively proven. Storm activity reported across portions of the North Atlantic during the voyage period introduced the possibility that severe weather may have overtaken the steamer without warning. Contemporary weather observations described unstable winter conditions developing across sections of the ocean traversed by westbound vessels during February 1893. Heavy seas alone could not fully explain the disappearance, yet they provided a plausible environment within which structural damage, flooding, or cargo instability might rapidly escalate into catastrophe. Ice conditions drifting through northern shipping lanes added another layer of uncertainty to theories attempting to explain the disappearance of the RMS Naronic. Long before the Titanic disaster permanently fixed iceberg danger within public consciousness, mariners crossing the North Atlantic already understood the risks posed by floating ice carried southward during colder months. Some later speculation considered whether collision with ice may have damaged the vessel severely enough to sink it before any meaningful response could occur. Weeks after the ship vanished, the Atlantic still yielded no confirmed wreckage field substantial enough to explain how such a large steamer could disappear so completely. Search efforts during this period depended largely on ships visually scanning open water, a process severely limited by weather, distance, and the enormous size of the Atlantic itself. Even if debris existed somewhere along the vessel's route, currents and storms could disperse evidence across vast areas before any search vessel approached nearby. Then, months after official concern had already hardened into presumed loss, strange reports began surfacing from distant coastlines about bottles recovered from the sea. These accounts transformed the RMS Naronic mystery into something far more unsettling because they appeared to suggest that messages from the doomed vessel may have survived long after the ship itself disappeared. Newspapers quickly circulated the reports, and public fascination intensified almost immediately around the possibility that final words from aboard the missing steamer had somehow crossed the Atlantic independently. One alleged message reportedly described flooding aboard the RMS Naronic and claimed the vessel was sinking with little hope of survival. According to reports published during the period, the note had been sealed inside a bottle supposedly recovered far from the ship's last known route. The wording varied across different newspaper accounts, yet the emotional effect remained consistent because the message appeared to represent the final written thoughts of men trapped aboard a disappearing ship with no other means of communication. Other accounts connected to the bottle discoveries contained fragmented wording, desperate phrasing, and references that some readers believed could only have come from men aboard the missing ship. Certain reports described panic, heavy seas, or rapidly worsening conditions aboard the vessel, though details often differed depending on which publication circulated the story. The uncertainty surrounding the exact contents of these alleged notes only deepened public fascination because each variation seemed to preserve part of a narrative no investigator could fully verify. Maritime authorities examining these supposed final messages quickly encountered inconsistencies involving handwriting, wording, dates, and the circumstances surrounding their discovery. Some bottles reportedly appeared in locations difficult to reconcile with Atlantic current patterns, while others lacked sufficient evidence connecting them directly to the RMS Neronic at all. Investigators therefore faced the difficult task of separating possible truth from sensational reporting during a period when newspapers frequently amplified maritime mysteries to capture public attention. Newspapers throughout Britain and beyond amplified public fascination with the alleged notes because they appeared to offer the only surviving human voice connected to the vanished steamer. In the absence of wreckage or survivors, even uncertain fragments acquired enormous emotional power within public imagination. Readers encountered not simply a missing ship, but the possibility that desperate men aboard the RMS Neronic had attempted one final act of communication while disappearing into the Atlantic. Skeptics argued that the bottle messages reflected opportunistic hoaxes created after widespread reporting on the disappearance of the RMS Neronic entered public attention. Maritime disasters during this era often generated fabricated survivor stories, invented letters, and false discoveries as newspapers competed for dramatic developments surrounding unresolved tragedies. Some investigators believed the alleged notes fit comfortably within that pattern, especially given the absence of verifiable evidence linking the bottles conclusively to the missing vessel. Yet even investigators who doubted the authenticity of the messages struggled to fully dismiss the unsettling possibility that at least one of them may have originated aboard the ship. The Atlantic's enormous currents made unusual drift patterns possible, and isolated cases of authentic bottled messages reaching distant shores had been documented before. Because the RMS Neronic left behind almost no other trace, the disputed notes remained impossible to completely disprove, preserving a narrow space where uncertainty continued surviving, alongside skepticism. Long before distress radio transformed maritime emergencies into immediate events, sailors facing disaster at sea sometimes relied on physical messages cast into the water as their final attempt at communication. Bottles, sealed containers, and handwritten notes represented one of the only methods capable of carrying information beyond a sinking vessel once visual contact disappeared. Such attempts rarely succeeded, yet the very act of writing and casting a message into the ocean reflected an awareness that the sea might outlive those aboard long enough to deliver their final words somewhere else. Ocean currents capable of carrying debris and sealed bottles across enormous distances complicated efforts to determine where any alleged message might truly have originated. The Atlantic did not move randomly, but through vast circulating systems capable of transporting floating objects between continents over extended periods. Investigators examining the RMS Neronic reports therefore confronted a difficult reality. Even if a bottle genuinely emerged from the Atlantic months later, proving its exact point of origin remained nearly impossible. The RMS Neronic therefore became associated not with a confirmed final transmission, but with scattered words that may have drifted for months through the Atlantic after the ship itself disappeared. This gave the mystery a different emotional character from later maritime disasters involving radio distress calls or direct witness testimony. Instead of hearing the final moments unfold in real time, the world encountered only delayed fragments emerging from the ocean long after the disaster had already passed beyond recovery. Historians examining the case decades later continued encountering the same unresolved contradiction between the total absence of verified wreckage and the persistence of stories surrounding the bottle notes. The ship itself remained physically lost somewhere beneath the Atlantic, while the alleged messages survived primarily through newspaper archives, maritime discussions, and repeated retellings that blurred the line between documented fact and uncertain memory. Every later investigation eventually returned to the same unanswered question regarding whether the crew truly attempted to communicate their fate, after all ordinary contact had already failed. What deepened the mystery further was that the RMS Neronic vanished during the final years before wireless telegraphy permanently altered how ships communicated distress across open water. Within only a few years, maritime operators would begin using radio systems capable of transmitting emergency messages across enormous distances almost instantly. The RMS Neronic therefore disappeared at the precise historical moment when the old silence of the Atlantic was beginning to end, yet not quickly enough to save those aboard from vanishing inside it. Had the vessel disappeared only a decade later, radio operators might have transmitted position updates, weather concerns, or emergency calls capable of narrowing the uncertainty surrounding its fate. Investigators may have possessed coordinates, witness accounts, or distress signals revealing at least part of the sequence leading to disaster. Instead, the RMS Neronic crossed the Atlantic during one of the last periods when a large ship could disappear almost completely beyond the reach of immediate human communication. The Atlantic kept moving westward, long after the last unverified message drifted beyond the hands that may have written it.